Well, hello everyone, and welcome to week 2 of IFSM438. Let's do a quick recap of what we talked about last week before we get into this week's material. Last week we talked about the introductory part of our class. We defined projects and the organization for project management. And the big thing I want to recall from last week is we talked about the project phases, processes, knowledge areas, and process groups, and we're going to talk about those some more. And we're going to continue to talk about those as the class goes on because they're very important. And the last thing we touched on last week was the project charter. This week, at the end of the slides here, you'll see the assignment for this week is to create a project charter. We're going to talk about that some more. All right, so this week we're going to talk just briefly about selecting and starting projects as kind of a stage setter for where we're going, and then we're going to actually get into some of the project management processes. We're going to just touch again on the phases to make sure you can see how the process groups and the phases align. And then out of the process groups, we're going to talk about the initiating and the planning process groups in particular. And then from the knowledge areas, we're going to talk about scope and communications. And we'll talk about how that all ties together here shortly. Okay, so let's talk about project selection. Projects just don't happen. Usually there's a stakeholder or a sponsor within an organization who decides that a project needs to occur. And generally projects are designed to meet goals and objectives, and the author does a good job of breaking it down in the textbook. So you can take a look at that. It's in section 7.1. The only thing I want to highlight here that's important is that second to last bullet from the bottom there, where we talk about project champions versus opponents. It's very important when we talk about communications and stakeholders to understand who your champions are and who your opponents are. The champions are those who are very interested in the project being successful, and opponents are those who are either not interested in the project or actually may have a desire to see the project not do well for any particular reason. It's important to understand who everybody is when we're managing our stakeholders and doing communication. So we're going to talk about that later, but keep that in mind that there's folks that are really interested in the project and want to see it succeed, and then those who really are against the project, and then in between is everybody else. And we have to manage all of those stakeholders. So let's talk about the beginning of a project or project startup. The author does a good job of breaking this down in section 7.3 of the ebook. The key things here is it really depends on a lot of different things. The organization where you work, whether it's a big project or a small project, whether they have a dedicated project management office, whether there's a dedicated project manager or just somebody who's tapped, hey, you're going to manage this project. Lots of different environmental factors come into play here, but the big things that happen during project startup is you really have to define how you're going to go and manage the work of getting things done. You're going to develop a project management plan. You're going to establish your team. The team might just be one person, might just be you, or it might be a whole team of people spread through different areas of your organization and different parts of the country and worldwide. You'll at least establish your initial timeline and budget that you have to work with, and you're going to kind of work through the scope of what you're going to deliver. We're going to talk about scope more, and then you're going to culminate that with a kickoff meeting, which is where you bring all the stakeholders together and you really tell them this is what we're going to do, this is our initial timeline, and you make sure that they understand what's going to go on. So that's really how projects begin, and that happens in the initiating process group. So let's talk about the phases before we get into the process groups again in the next slide. But what we're talking about right now is phase one there, the project conception and initiation. And the big thing there is when the project starts here, initiation, and then the project charter, which we'll talk about later, which you're going to do as part of the assignment for this week. So again, last week we talked about the phases, and there's the 5 phases that you see here, and they align directly to the 5 process groups that we're going to talk about next. So these are the PMBOK or PMI process groups. So you have initiating, and that's what we're talking about now. We're in the initiating process group. Then you have planning. We're going to talk about the planning process group as well. Then when the planning is done, you get to the actual executing of the project tasks. You're going to monitor and control what you're doing and what's being produced. And then finally, when everything is done, you're going to close your project. So those are the process groups. And right now, we're over here in initiating, which lines up with phase 1 that we just talked about in the previous slide. I showed this last week. This is very important. I want to highlight this again, where process groups and knowledge areas, how they align. We have 5 process groups, which you see along the top, and 10 knowledge areas, which you see on the left-hand side. What we're going to talk about today, you can see, are highlighted with the arrows and the stars. We're going to talk about the initiating process group, and we already did touch on that a bit, where you're going to develop the charter and you're going to identify your stakeholders. Then we're going to talk about the planning process group, which is the largest of the 5 and has the most processes in it. And what we're going to talk about in particular today in the knowledge areas is scope management and communications management. And we're going to talk about them in a little more detail next. But I want to show you kind of the big picture of all of the different process groups and knowledge areas and what we're going to specifically talk about this week. So let's talk about the initiating process group. It's a pretty simple process group. It really only has 2 processes, which is develop the charter and identify stakeholders. And you'll be doing the develop charter process or task as your assignment for this week as a group assignment. And identify stakeholders is very important. We're going to talk about communications later. You have to know who your stakeholders are so that you can effectively communicate with them. Because if you don't, then there are going to be people who are ill-informed about what's going on in the project, and they're key players in how things go. Now, I'm sorry this is sideways. There's no way for me to put it on the slide the other way to make it big enough for you to see. But the planning process group is really big. It encompasses elements from all 10 of the knowledge areas. And again, with the arrows, I just wanted to highlight out of this whole planning, out of this whole process group, what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about over here in the bottom left, which is the project scope management knowledge area, and we're also going to talk about the communication management knowledge area. So planning has a lot of different knowledge areas involved in it, in that process group. We're going to talk about 2 in particular. So let's talk about scope. Scope is terribly important. You're going to be discussing scope in the discussion, or covering scope in the discussion that you're going to have as part of the class. So let's talk about it here. Now the e-text or the ebook talks about 2 different types of scope: product scope and project scope. They're used interchangeably, but for our purposes, when we say scope, what we mean is the project scope, which is the work performed to deliver a product, service, or result within the specified features and functions. And I have a cartoon here which is very applicable to scope, and it really lines up nicely with the communications part we're going to talk about later. So if you look at this thing here, it shows several different views of the way different stakeholders understand the scope. And the top left here, how the customer explained it. This is what the customer explained that they wanted. Okay. What they really needed was here at the bottom right. And of course, everyone has a different understanding of what was explained, how the project manager understood it, what the engineer took away from that, from the requirements, and actually designed, what the sales reps said how fantastic it was going to be. And the big takeaway from this cartoon here is that everybody has a different understanding of what is to be done. And the key thing for you as a project manager is to make sure that everybody understands and agrees to what the scope of the project is, what you're going to do to deliver a product, a service, or a result with the features and functions, and everybody agrees to what it's going to be and what it's going to look like. And that's where communications is terribly important, because if your key stakeholders have a different concept of what the deliverable is supposed to look like, and then you deliver something that is completely different, then you're going to have an unhappy stakeholder and you're going to have an unsuccessful project. So scope is terribly important. So how do we manage scope? So on the left, you see a graphic from the PMBOK, which is from the managed scope knowledge area. So there's lots of different processes and sub-elements in there, but really it comes down to just these things here I highlight on the right. We need to plan what we're going to do. Scope management just doesn't happen. We need to develop how we're going to go about gathering requirements, how we're going to document them, who we're going to talk to, and all that is found in the scope management plan. So you can't just go about it randomly. You have to have a plan to get the requirements so that you can build your scope, and that's the scope management plan. Then you have to actually go about and collect requirements from all different levels, the end users, all the way up to the higher levels, to make sure that you have all of the requirements documented. And you can actually, or you will actually, not in this class, but as a project manager, develop a requirements traceability matrix where you can say each of the things that your scope has to accomplish, where you can find them from your requirements document. And then you will actually come up with the key thing, which is defining your scope, a scope statement that says in words exactly what it is you're going to produce, either the product or the service, what it is it's going to be. And then you're going to create a work breakdown structure, which is just a more detailed version of your scope statement. And we're going to talk about this in detail here in the next couple of slides. But really, the key thing about scope is understanding how you're going to go about getting the scope, how you're going to manage it, getting the requirements, refining those and defining your scope as a scope statement, and then creating a more detailed view of it called a work breakdown structure. So let's talk about the work breakdown structure. There's a great definition from the PMBOK there. I don't think I can add or take away anything from that, so we're just going to read it real quick here. It's a hierarchical decomposition of the total scope of work to be carried out by the project team to accomplish the project objectives and create the required deliverables. It organizes and defines the totality or the total scope of the project and represents the work specified in the current and approved scope statement. So earlier we developed the scope statement. Now we're going to create the work breakdown structure, which is just a decomposition of it into smaller parts. So if we said build a house, okay, as our project, now we need to actually define it a little more. The scope would say exactly what the house was supposed to look like and where it was going to be built and how many stories and so on. And then the WBS is the work breakdown structure, which provides a structured vision of what you're going to build. It's going to break the construction of the house into the component parts. It helps you understand what needs to be done. It shows the hierarchy of the deliverables. And it can be organized by phases or by deliverables. And the key thing here is it's not a schedule. It's just a decomposition of your scope, a breakdown into smaller parts of the main deliverable, the scope of the main deliverable. So it is not a schedule. So let's talk about the creating WBS process, or the work breakdown structure. The PMBOK uses a pretty simple methodology for each process. Each process has inputs, it has tools and techniques, and it has outputs. And this little graphic here shows that pretty nicely. So to create a WBS, you have your scope statement, which we already created. You have the different requirements from the different stakeholders, talk about what they want the actual product or service to do, and those are your inputs. And then your tools and techniques are going to be decomposition. We're going to talk about that next. And then the output is the actual work breakdown structure and a dictionary, which is a definition of all the elements that you're going to see in the work breakdown structure. And that makes up your scope baseline. So here's an example. In this example, the actual project, the scope, or what it is you're going to produce, your deliverable, is software product version 5.0. But you can't just say, hey, build me 5.0. You have to break it down into its component parts so that you can actually manage the development of this version of software. So project management is part of it. So that's a sub-element, okay, project management. Developing your product requirements is a sub-element. Actually doing the design is a sub-element. Building it is a sub-element, and then integrating and testing it is a sub-element. So the high-level deliverable here is the version 5.0 of your software product. Okay, the sub-elements, or the major sub-elements you see here, are in black, and then each one of those is decomposed to a lower level. So if I was going to look at actually building the software, I would have to build the software, I'd have to build the user documentation, I have to build the training material. Someone has to actually do the software coding, they have to actually write and create the user documents, and they have to write and create the training materials. So that's how you break down this major subtask. And that's all a WBS is. You take a large deliverable or a large end state and you break it down into the different sub-elements and then continue to break those down or decompose them until you get into manageable chunks that you can assign resources to actually get the work done. So what we just looked at was a top-down WBS creation. It started with the final product at the top, and then you look at the major sub-elements or the major deliverables that are part of the project, and you decompose those to a level of detail appropriate to manage your project. A simple project, you probably don't need to decompose it too much. A complex project, like building a bridge, is going to have a much higher level of decomposition because it is a much more complex and large project. The key thing here is that each level is 100% of the work element above it. Okay, that's really what's important. And then the second thing here is you're going to review and refine your WBS until the stakeholders agree. That's part of the communications part, so that everyone agrees. We've agreed to the scope statement, and we've agreed to the different sub-elements, which is the work breakdown structure, so that what we're producing, everybody says, yes, that's what we want, and we agree to it. So you don't have misunderstandings later on. So how do we go about creating a WBS? Okay, the project is at the top. So whatever it is, build version 5 of the software is at the top. The major sub-elements of that are at level 2, and that's what you saw on that graphic. Project management is always at level 2 because you always have a project management function that goes on throughout the life of the project. So you see here, the WBS always has a project management element. Remember that, it always has a project management element, so for all the assignments you're going to do here, you must have that. And you can decompose level 2 to level 3 and continue. It says don't go too deep. It has to be realistic for the type of project. So you can go crazy down to the smallest level, but you really don't need to do that. You need to go low enough that it's manageable and you can assign those lower levels to a person or a group, and they can actually accomplish it within a certain amount of time, and you can manage it that way. And it usually has an outline numbering scheme, which I'm going to show later on, which you'll see at Microsoft Project does a great job of actually including in there, and you'll use those outlines in Microsoft Project. Here's an example, and this is from not from the PMBOK, but this is from the practice standard for WBS, which is an additional standard document or book that you can find on the PMI website if you are a PMI member. But this is a little better than the what I showed earlier. So in this case here, the end product is a bicycle. It's at the top. That's your level 1. Your level 2 are the major sub-elements of it. So when we're creating our WBS, the major sub-elements are the frame, the crank, the wheels, the brakes, and so on. And you see project management is there. So those are the major sub-elements. And then you break them down to a lower level. So the frame is decomposed further into the frame, the handlebar, the fork, the seats, and so on. You can see here, these are specific tangible deliverables. And here's the hierarchical code. So we start as 1 would be the highest level, then 1.1, 1.1.1, and so on as you decompose it. So each particular element has its own WBS code, and that's very important for tracking, and it helps you really see the totality of everything. So this is a good example, and it really kind of shows a better version of decomposition. So now that we've managed the scope, we've developed the scope baseline, which is the scope statement, the work breakdown structure, and the work breakdown structure dictionary. We didn't talk about the dictionary too much, but that's what's in the scope baseline. Now we need to focus on project communications, and in our book it's in section 7.5. And as with everything else, this is from the PMBOK, generally each of the different knowledge areas has an element where you're going to plan what you're going to do it, and you're going to find out how well you did. And that's exactly how this one is laid out. So you have to plan communications. It doesn't just happen. How are you going to communicate with your stakeholders? Are you going to have face-to-face meetings? Are you going to send emails? Are you going to have teleconferences, WebExes? How often are you going to meet with them? What type of information do they need, and so on? That's what you need to plan. Otherwise, you're going to have unhappy stakeholders. They want information. They're going to constantly call you or email you, and it's not going to be an effective way to manage a project. It's better to understand what they want, develop a plan to give them what they need, and then tell them, here's how you're going to get information, and then actually do that. And then managed communications is actually going about doing it, holding your meetings with your project team, with your stakeholders, providing status reports, answering questions. That kind of stuff is actually managing communications. And then here is checking up on how things are going, monitoring communications. Is it going well? Are my stakeholders generally happy? Or are they calling me 10 times a day asking me questions? If you're getting a lot of phone calls and questions, then you're probably not doing a very good job communicating the information that needs to go to your stakeholders. This is in the PMBOK. There's a different version in our text, but they're generally the same. And what it is a responsibility assignment matrix, and this is kind of important. When you have a small project, this is probably not that important. When you have a large project, it becomes very important. But what you see here is it's called a RACI chart, and RACI stands for Responsible, Accountable, Consult, and Inform. And it really says for the different activities here on the vertical, and then the different people that are involved here on the horizontal, who has what particular level of involvement. Okay, accountable is the highest level. A person who is accountable is the one who has to provide that particular task, who's accountable for it. If it goes well, they get a slap on the back. If it goes poorly, they get yelled at. So that's what accountable means. Responsible is generally the person who's actually doing the work. Okay, so in this case, Ann is accountable for the charter, but Ben is responsible for it. He's actually doing a majority of the work. So in this case, Ben probably works for Ann. Okay, and that's generally what that means. You can see who is accountable. Only one person is accountable for each task. You can have more than one person responsible for it, but only one person is accountable. And then the I and the C mean inform and consult. So if you're looking at creating the charter, and Ben is actually responsible for it, he needs to inform Carlos, Dina, and Ed of what's going on. He doesn't really need their input. He just needs to let them know what's going on. But if we're looking at collect requirements and Carlos is responsible, he needs to consult. He needs to get input from Dina and Ed about the requirements. He needs to inform Ann of what's going on while he's doing his task of collecting requirements. So that's the difference between the four different functions here of responsible, accountable, consult, and inform. For big projects, this is very important. So let's look at our assignment for week 2. Okay, you're going to actually, as a team, create your project charter. It seems like a big task. It's not that bad. There is a template or an example in the classroom that you can use. It's really good. So you're going to work as a team to create your charter based on the scenario of Mama's Bakery. So anyway, that's the team assignment. And then you're going to individually, using Microsoft Project, create a WBS, a very simple work breakdown structure for either a wedding or a reunion. That's also in the assignments area. It gives you all the details. And there's also a document in there that says what you need to include and so on. Read the how to build work breakdown structures in the additional material in your class for week 2. Read the scenario in the ITP, which gives you all the details you need to do to build your charter. And then also develop a problem statement. A problem statement is kind of what we're going to do, what we need to solve for Mama's Bakery. That becomes very helpful, and it helps frame everything you're going to do. And I'll have an example of that posted in our class. So the outcome, the assignment, the group assignment is a project charter. And as I said, there is an example, but kind of what the charter does, it tells you the purpose of the project, gives you the high-level objectives and success criteria, how we know we're successful. It talks about the requirements, describes them, some initial milestones, at least at the high level. It talks about some risk, how much money you have to work with, who your key stakeholders are, and so on. So all of the things we talked about in the slides today are going to be reflected in the charter. And it'll be due the end of week 2. So our discussion goes right along with our class material talking about scope. So we talked about what scope is. So here we're going to look at scope creep. Is it inevitable, and how do we deal with it? That's a great topic. Very important, happens a lot in projects. Group B is the lead for setting up the thread for that. Each person in Group B needs to have their own thread for that in the discussion area. And Groups A, C, and D, of course, will do their responses. Okay, here's the key thing. If you have questions, please email me or post something on Ask Your Professor. Don't wait to the last minute, and work with your group, and we will see you next week.